we are going to be going over how to say things like hello, goodbye, excuse me, please, thank you, all in Toki Pona. And if you're familiar with the linguistics terminology for it, this would be what is called a phatic phrase. Or more exactly, in other languages, they are commonly called phatic phrases. They're short, polite, usually polite, turns of phrase that don't necessarily mean or express anything strongly, right? They may be only polite without being expressive. Like if you're walking past somebody and you say, "Oh, excuse me," that's the end of the exchange. Or maybe somebody teaches you something really insightful, and your only response is, "Oh, thank you." Well, you can certainly do that in Toki Pona. Nothing really stops you from simply saying, sina Pona, from any particular exchange, right? Like if somebody does something kind for you, sina Pona. But we can go a lot deeper than that. So we're going to start, like I said, with hello and goodbye. And of course, I'm sure all of you are familiar with the common way to say hello in Toki Pona, and it is Toki. And of course, there's the Sitalen Pona for it. Now, hellos are usually as simple as that. There's actually not a huge amount of context necessary to establish that you're saying hi to somebody. And there may be other more subtle ways to greet somebody as far as like how you express it. Like I commonly say Toki because I'm genuinely excited to say hey to everybody here. But of course, Toki is about where hello starts and stops. But you can go further from there. Where is my pen gone? I have stuck it here. Here we go. So Toki is where hello starts and stops. But what about the goodbye, right? So when you're no longer talking to somebody, the person who is leaving normally says something like, "Mi tawa," right? And of course, if you are saying goodbye, you say "mi tawa," what does somebody else say back to you? They don't say "mi tawa" as well, because that wouldn't be true. When you interpret this statement literally, it means more like, "I am moving." And in this case, it's a bit more specifically, "I am leaving," right? And so the proper response is well wishes. You would say in response, "Tawa Pona," right? And a lot of Toki Pona works this way. Let's take, for example, what you would do when, say, your friend is, or rather, you are leaving VR chat. You might say "mi tawa," of course, meaning "I am leaving," and that works just fine. And as you're leaving, you say in response to everybody who's there, "Musi Pona" or "Awen Pona," respectively, "have fun in a good way," or "stay well," "be good as you are staying," right? These ideas are, I think, the foundation of polite conversation in Toki Pona, and not in a phatic way, but in a transformative way, I think. In Toki Pona, hello and goodbye aren't just a simple exchange to be polite. You have to think a little bit more, like you do when putting together phrases in a sentence, to express not just "I am leaving," "oh, leave well." It's deeper than that, and it's more than that. You are telling them, hey, that thing you're doing, keep doing it great, right? And that's just for goodbye, right? And there's plenty of other ways you could do this. Let's say you're leaving a classroom early. You could say, "kama sona Pona, mi tawa," right? Or in the case that you are leaving a workplace and everybody else is still there working, "pali Pona," right? Goodbye is highly contextual in Toki Pona. It has to do with what is actually excuse me, what is actually going on. And of course, we can go a few steps deeper than that. So let's clear this. Oop, didn't quite get it. There we go. What about if you were leaving for a very short period of time? Well, you as the speaker might say, "Mi tawa lili," and then mi, comma, sin, right? Little phrases like this as pairs now work together to express a little bit more specific of an idea as you are exiting an event, an exchange, something going on, right? If you say me tawa lili, me kama sin, you're expressing two different ideas here. And that is, first, you are leaving for a little bit, as in moving a small distance or a small amount or a small away, right? Me kama sin is implied to be future tense, wherein you will come back again, right? Taken literally, this would be, I arrive newly, right? And taken together, I'm drawing my arrows inside the board. Taken together, they mean something like, yeah, I'll be right back. Which in English, of course, is one statement. And there's nothing really stopping you from cutting out this first statement and saying just, me kama sin, right? So there's a quick and convenient way to express, hey, I am leaving. But that's not the only way to do it either. Excuse me, I am leaving for a short period of time. But like I said, that is not the only way. It's also fairly common to say, mi weka. I am flubbing this writing today. Mi weka lili, leading to mi kama sin. And then, in the simplest case, you don't even have to express the specificity of, oh, I'm going to be right back. You can just say, mi tawa, and then head on your way. Somebody else acknowledging this can say anything from, tawa pona, to, pili mila sina okama sin pona. As in my feelings, you should come back well, come back safely. Right? You can get to any level of specificity that you want to express how much you care, how much you really want your response, right? And that's true in many, many contexts. Any little questions about this particular phrase? All good? All right. So when I started, I introduced hello and goodbye. And hello is, of course, Toki. And goodbye, tawa pona, awan pona, musi pona, excuse me. Any sort of well wishes having to do with those who are staying behind to do whatever thing. Well, what about right after you say hello? Then you have actual starting conversation. And there's a few ways to do that. Of course, in English, we would say something like, oh, what's up? What's going on? How are you doing? Right? And all of those ideas are expressed in the simple sentence, sina seme. Sina seme, right? Taken literally, this is referring to you, second person pronoun, and then asking for information in the verb position of the sentence. So to back up a little bit and talk about what that means, we would look at the question format of Toki Pona. Here, we're literally asking, what property does sina have, or what is sina doing, or where is sina? Any of those are possible, right? Any of those are possible. So the person who this question is targeted at, they can respond in any way they would like, right? In this case, they could respond with, mi pona. And that's it. Well, we've run into a problem here, right? And that problem is, in English, and I'm sure in other languages as well, what gives rise to these phatic phrases is this lack of want for conversation in some cases, or at the very least, not really being sure what to say. And a lot of people have expressed, again in English, when faced with a question like, how are you doing? They answer it literally. And honestly, I don't see any reason why we can't do this in Toki Pona, why we can't be straightforward in Toki Pona with what we say. I think that's important. And so, the thing is here, you could end this conversation as, sina seme. The other person responds, mi pona, sina seme. And then the first person goes, mi pona kin. And that's it. That's the conversation. But that doesn't really work. That doesn't really work. Is that a conversation? Have you exchanged any information? Do you know anything about each other? I think the purpose of language is ultimately to communicate, right? And so in Toki Pona, we can make this more interesting. So let me clear this real quick. We're going to put sina seme back, and then we'll go back. We'll be backing up a little bit after this to talk about other ways to say, hey, what's going on, which I glossed over a bit before. But sina seme. This is about as open-ended a question as you could get. And I encourage you to answer honestly to a question like this. Like you've just said, hello, what's going on? And there were people in the crowd earlier asking, hey, sina seme, right? And I would respond, tempo pinilila mi pali mute, mi pali e ilo sin pitoki pona. Or, tempo esun pinila mi pali e ilo sin mi pana e ona tawa lipu mi. I created a new tool and I put it on my website.
Welcome.
I encourage you at all times to take this question seriously, to take this question like something that truly matters, right? And yeah, not every conversation in the world is going to be life-alteringly deep, but I think there is value, and there is especially value in Toki Pona, to expressing yourself honestly, not just pausing and then just being polite, but truly having a conversation, right? So, sina seme, as I described before. Mi pali, mute. And then going on to describe what all you did. And then at the end of your description, of course, you want to ask, maybe, sama la sina seme. Now, this particular sentence, I've kind of tacked on sama la, so I'll talk about that real quick. Of course, when you are bouncing around in a conversation in Toki Pona, it's fairly frequent to use things like sama la, ante la, poka la as ways to get around the conversation and express the relationship of your next statement to that part of the conversation, right? So in this case, when I tack on sama la, it's something like, in a similar way, what are you doing, right? Sama la sina seme. In this context, it would also be valid, I think at least, to say poka la. And you can interpret that being something like, so where sama is in a similar way to what was previously said in this context, poka would be like adjacent to what was previously said, right? So something that is expected to be similar, but not necessarily, or something that is a little bit similar, but not completely, that sort of idea. But when you're bouncing around a conversation in Toki Pona, these little bits of context crop up and pull you forward. Does that make sense, that idea? And it's also worth mentioning that these little bits of context like this are also non-essential. There is nothing wrong with, one person said to you, sina seme, and you respond with your whole spiel about, I've been doing this for the past couple of days. And then you also ask of them, sina seme. No problem with that. I think the ultimate thing here is recognizing the importance of having the conversation, right? Wanting to be in the conversation. So, I mentioned before, there are more ways to express this idea of, hey, what's up, than just saying sina seme, as in, what are you doing? You could also say, seme li lon. Now, I will pause here for a moment to note, lon is kind of a confusing concept to newer speakers. It has this problem where it expresses a concept that's kind of hard to express in English. Lon has to do with truth and with things that exist and existence itself. It can also be used in pretty much every part of speech, including as a preposition, right? And so its meaning is kind of confused here. Or not here in particular, but in general. It is easy to get mixed up when thinking about what lon means. Here, when somebody says seme li lon, the subject is what is being asked about. And so we're trying to answer the question here, what things exist? But if we're talking about a colloquial context, as in we're just having a conversation with a friend, this means something like, hey, what's up? This is as close as you can get to, hey, what's up? What's going on? What's happening? What exists? Right? Another common way to ask the question, to continue a greeting, to start a conversation. Now, there's one more that I'm going to go over, but I will note here that I discourage its use. Not that people won't use it, but you will encounter it occasionally. And that would be sina pali e seme. Now, this one is a little bit problematic because of that word pali there in the middle, in the verb position. And the problem with it is that pali to most Toki Pona speakers means to create or to work. And so maybe this is a bit of a myopic question. Maybe this question is asking, what are you working on? What are you making? And not really asking, what are you doing? But it is worth mentioning, thinking about the fact that pali is defined as meaning do in Toki Pona, the language of good. And so it's perfectly fine to interpret the sentence as, what are you doing? What thing are you doing? Well, the reason I bring this one up as a possible greeting, again, people will use it. You will encounter it occasionally. People still do use pali this way. And so, yeah, you could absolutely ask this question and people would understand you. But again, I discourage it because pali has moved away from that do definition. This no longer really means, what are you doing? It is a more specific question, meaning like, what are you working on or what are you creating? But let's think about that for a moment. What if we actually use this question and the word pali as we intended, as to work on or to create? Say you walk into your workplace and your coworker is sitting there typing away at a computer or maybe punching at a register or something like that. You could reasonably ask at that point, sina pali e seme? As in, what are you working on? That would be fine. And a similar thing goes for if somebody is, I don't know, working at a computer in general. Maybe they have a book that they're writing in. Maybe they are at the store and they're buying things that look like they're for a big crafts project. Who knows, right? But there are obviously contexts in which it's reasonable to ask, hey, what are you working on? And hopefully you get back, a full-bodied answer, something that really tells you, hey, this person is thinking deeply and passionately about what they are working on, right? That is the hope for conversations in Toki Pona, that it's beyond that minimum level of, oh, hi, how you doing? Oh, I'm fine, right? We want to go beyond that. So, there's another group of common phatic phrases I want to go over here. And these would be, in English, please, and, my handwriting is atrocious today. Thank you. So, in Toki Pona, there are no direct words for either please or thank you. And especially for a brand new learner, that's kind of confusing. Because, one of the very first things you see or hear when learning a new language is all these little polite phrases that you need to navigate around when you don't know the language really, right? Please, thank you, hello, goodbye, where's the bathroom? All you need, right? And the very first things you learn. Well, Toki Pona, again, doesn't have these, but it does have close analogs. And I think the first one of these, please, is kind of interesting. Toki Pona, people often say that Toki Pona has this polite default assumption, and for the time being, we're going to assume that is true. I personally have some reservations about that. I think it's more of an honest default assumption, but I digress. We can still take advantage of that. We can assume that somebody has good intentions when they're speaking in Toki Pona. And so please isn't really necessary. And so if you want to ask somebody to do something, you don't attack on a word like please. You can say something like, I need to walk away from the board a little bit. O weka e yaki. Take out the trash. Or clean out the bathtub. O weka e yaki, right? And that, even though it is a command, has an implicit politeness to it, right? It is possible to be rude or mean in Toki Pona, but by default, there really isn't a core assumption of you being rude or impolite or anything else. And so if you give somebody an instruction like, O weka e yaki, it really wouldn't be a problem, right? Or in Toki Pona, it wouldn't be a problem. Because the statement itself is polite. If you would like to weaken the statement a little bit in the sense of trying to make it even more polite, you can ask if somebody has the ability to do this something, right? So of course, there's nothing wrong with using a direct command. You can say, O pona eni, hey, fix this, right? And that doesn't have to be impolite, and it doesn't have to contain the word please, because it's polite on its own. But maybe you want to be a little bit more general and safe with it. So you would say, sina ken ala ken ni, which is something like, are you able to do this? And of course, there is this common assumption, even in Toki Pona I've seen this, where if you ask if somebody is able to do something, it's also an implicit ask for them to actually do it as well, right? If somebody says in English, hey, can you take out the trash? It's also a request to take out the trash, right? And in Toki Pona, I think that's true as well. That's commonly true as far as I have seen. And so you have these two different ways that are kind of like expressing please, right? They're kind of like, hey, I am expressing this in a polite and kind way. Here is my request. This is all you need, really. In fact, it would be perfectly fine to stick to either one of these independently, right? They are both going to express this idea fully. As I noted before, the sina ken ala ken version is a little weaker in a sense, because in the first case, you are, of course, providing an instruction. And this is very clearly and without any doubt saying, hey, do that thing. Versus the second one, which is, in terms of its literal interpretation, only asking if you are able to do something, right? But I think the higher level idea of both of these sentences is very similar. At least, okay, not both these sentences, but you get the idea. These sentences are, in fact, different. But if you say, O ni versus sina ken ala ken ni, same idea, expressed in different and differently polite ways. So, any questions? Any questions about that?
We've heard some people using sina o sometimes also to soften it. Is that?
Yeah. So sina o, it's basically the same thing as the o that has no subject.
Yeah.
The whole idea of it is that you're directing explicitly who it's at. So if you just say o ni to somebody, like an individual person, they know it's directed at them. But if you say o ni to a group of people, it may not be so clear whether it's meant to be at the whole group or some individuals in the group or one person in the group or what, right? But if you're more specific, like if I say ya nia o ni, well then there, you know for a fact, I said, hey Nia, go do this. And that's about like the whole difference there, right? So if I say sina o ni, it just means it's directed explicitly at you, right? But a lot of times it's not necessary to say sina o ni, because sina, in terms of like the idea of a conversation, is already somebody who you have the attention of, who knows you're speaking directly to them, right? Mm-hmm. So it's basically the same statement, just with a little bit of, I guess, extra clarity. So we're going to move on to thank you. I keep doing this. Thank you. So, of course, Toki Pona doesn't have a specific word for thank you either, but it does have something really, really close, which is sina pona. And yeah, it is very, very common that if you do something for somebody, they're going to respond with sina pona. It's very common in the Kama Sona server where you'll see a new learner get a short lesson about, say, prepositions or preverbs or something complex in the language that's a little difficult to wrap your head around. They ask a question about it, and a teacher comes along and gives them an answer. And then they say, sina pona. Well, that's fantastic. And I think that is something that should be encouraged, right? But at the same time, Toki Pona again gives us the power to express more specifically what you are good from, what you are good for, what you have done for me that I appreciated, right? And so in kind of a maximalist way, you could say, sina pona tawa mi tan ni, sina pana e sona pi toki pona tawa mi. Literally, you are good because of this, or you are good to me because of this. You give knowledge of Toki Pona to me, right? And this is the thing that's like core to saying thank you in Toki Pona. This idea that you're going to be thanking somebody for a specific reason. Sina pona tan seme. Sina pona tan lon. You are good because you're here. And thank you so much for coming. You see what I mean? It's always something specific to thank somebody for, right? And yeah, it's also okay to be like, sina pona, and leave it at that. But I again encourage you to look for ways to express yourself and ways to show your thanks that are deeper than just saying, oh, thank you, right? If somebody provides you a lot of knowledge, you can also go further than just saying somebody is good. You can also provide them compliments in a variety of ways, right? So I discussed sina pona, and then you could say sina pona mute a. In this case, if somebody teaches you something really cool and useful, you can now, instead of saying, hey, you're just good, that's great, but you can also provide them a specific compliment for their knowledge or your appreciation of that, right? You could say, sina sona mute, sina yan sona, right? You can give any sort of compliment. One very interesting compliment that I see very often, especially in the Pali Musi channel on Mapona, is nasin sona. So this one is interesting because it's a kind of compliment that's not actually directly at the listener. In this case, the person who did whatever good thing that they got thanks for, right? This compliment is not directed at the listener. This compliment is directed at something the listener did. So this one I heard because I was having a discussion a while ago about whether the wings on birds are luka or noka, right? And in a similar vein, if the claws on birds are luka or noka. And after a while of discussion, what we came out to, and mind you, this isn't necessarily a nasin you should use, but it's very interesting to think about nonetheless. When a bird is using their claws to stand, they are noka. And when they are using their claws to hold things, they are luka. And when I expressed this, somebody said to me, nili nasin sona. This is a knowledgeable methodology. This is an interesting way to think about things, right? And so this is, I think, probably the most interesting way to express thanks to somebody in Toki Pona, right? This kind of compliment where you express your interest in what that person has done, right? And it's also worth mentioning here, since I've used sona quite a few times. Sona is not the only thing you can say thanks for, of course. You could also say, in a relatively similar vein, nasin wawa. Nasin wawa. And nasin wawa is not literally powerful, but you might think of it as a nasin that is highly capable. in nasin that is highly expressive, right? And so if you were to introduce an interesting concept that revolutionized your thinking about Toki Pona, like, I don't know, a new way to look at the grammar, or a new understanding of how prepositions work, right? You could say, nilin nasin wawa, to the person who gave you that knowledge, right? And what you're expressing there, of course, is a kind of thanks, right? It is a compliment and a kind of thanks all at the same time. This is, I think, the crux of how this kind of conversation works in Toki Pona. Again, yeah, you can always stop yourself at sina Pona. And certainly nobody would complain about that. That's perfectly expressive. It gets across the entire idea. But I promise you, and I say this from personal experience, if you take the time to express more specifically about what you mean, about what was meaningful in the thing somebody did for you, it will feel better. Not only for you, it will feel better to them too. There have been people in Mapona who I gave a little lesson to, and their response, their excitement for it made my day. Yeah, any questions?
On the sentence sina sona mute a, we could replace mute by suri.
Could you replace mute with suli? Okay. So that's kind of a lesson all of its own. I actually posed that question to Mapona a couple of weeks ago in the form of asking, do you use mute to refer to amounts versus volumes? And do you use suli to refer to amounts versus volumes, right? The answers were not very consistent, in honesty. I'm going to go ahead and say yes, just for the sake of, sina sona suli, you know importantly, you know largely, you know bigly, however you want to Englishize it. Yeah, that's totally valid. That said, if you want to think more deeply about it, mute is usually used to refer to both volumes, as in, telo mute lilon, there is a lot of water, and it can refer to amounts. Io mute lilon, there are a lot of things here, right? Referring to either a discrete number of things or volume of things that there's not a discrete amount of, right? There's a bit of discussion there. In this case, I personally conceptualize sona as a volume, but that's probably arbitrary. The ultimate answer to your question is yeah, you can totally use suli there, and it comes across pretty much the same way. Well, I hope this lesson has been helpful to you. I hope that you learned something, right? About not just the idea of like working through a conversation in this way, but also being able to express yourself more deeply in Toki Pona, right? That is all for this lesson. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much.